So I've had my hands in a few different, somewhat disparate projects lately that are, of course, all related to some extent, but sound pretty different when I try to explain them. In January, I facilitated a project called the Stranger Supper series, and this was a series of meals, performative meals along University Avenue at different restaurants, local restaurants. It was supported through the Irrigate Arts Initiative. So the idea was to build community and foster business during the construction period of the light rail construction. And so what these meals were, it's kind of complicated to explain, but basically members of the public were invited to submit their interest to play a main character, and that meant that they received a character profile that I created for them, and then 6 people came together as those characters and had dinner together. So 6 strangers coming together for dinner at a local restaurant, and anybody else was welcome to come and interact with the performance. If they wanted, they could create their own characters, they could interact as themselves, or they could just be a fly on the wall and eavesdrop and watch it unfold. And so it was sort of an experiment in what happens when you have only characters and no plot, because the plot just emerged from whatever the characters decided to do. And it also brought people to the restaurants who had never been there before. So it was a mix of performative experiment and food experimentation. The other big project I'm working on right now is a dance theater collaboration with the local ensemble supergroup, and that is going to be part of the Walker's Momentum New Dance Series this July at the Southern Theater. So that is kind of a merging of processes, a merging of movement processes and text playwriting processes. We're really developing everything from the ground up together. I'm performing with them as well as writing, and we're kind of seeing what unfolds. We have a lot of material right now that we're just getting to the stage of shaping, and so we don't exactly know what it's going to turn out to be, but it's been an exciting process. It's all sort of rooted in some personal stories that I collected over a few years, talking to people about big moments of life transition, big moments of life change and epiphany, I guess big or small, but small moments that led to big realizations and or very obvious big transitions in people's lives. And I had been thinking about how to use that material, how to interact with it as a playwright, because I didn't want to just fold those stories into fictional narrative, let's say. I really wanted to kind of get under the skin of those stories and try to see how I could investigate them a little further beyond the sort of events of the stories. So as I was thinking about it, it made a lot of sense to me to work with dancers, with people investigating movement, to kind of get at whatever that undercurrent is, get under the skin of what storytelling is. So that's been sort of our seed, drawing from those true stories and doing experiments with movement and experiments with text, and we'll see what comes of it in July. I have a couple other smaller projects that I've been working on in the cracks of those things, one of them being a family history project that is being edited together by a director named Dara Weinberg in Poland. She's from the US, she's a Fulbright scholar in Poland right now, and she's got eight of us writers working, telling some very personal family stories in the style of this Polish playwright. There's a piece called Small Narration, and I'm so sorry that I can't pronounce his name offhand. I'd have to be looking at it to playwright, which is shameful because I'm Polish, and I should have this in my brain right now. But it's Wojtek, and I can tell you his last name later. But he's written this piece called Small Narration that is digging up some of his own family history in a very stylized way, and Dara is bringing 8 writers together to dig up their own family histories, and some of them are from the U.S., some of them are from Poland, Hungary, and all kind of looking at their grandparents' or great-grandparents' generation, and then she's weaving them all together to present in Poland and in Hungary, and hopefully here in the States at some point. So these are the big things in the cooker right now.
Great. So how did the Stranger project go?
It was great and bizarre. I really had no expectations. I did not know what was going to happen, and of course there were moments where I started imagining the worst of the things that could happen when you bring strangers together in a space, in a performative setting. You never know how people are going to get carried away, but people seem to really come together in the spirit of the project, which was supporting these businesses and building community and just doing something fun together with other strangers in public. So I think all of the meals went, people stayed in character all the way through each of the meals. No one decided they were over it and stopped. People went really all out with their characters. There were some really excellent costumes. One of the characters was an entomologist, and she did all kinds of research to figure out what kind of entomologist she was. She had earrings that I believe were dragonflies, and she was very invested. We had some, one of the first meal was largely kind of insular. It was kind of difficult to hear the conversations that they were having, so people at other tables started finding ways to interact and to try and spur the characters to be more performative. So they were sending notes to the table through waiters, and actually the waiters and the restaurant owner began getting involved. This was at Non-Vietnamese Bistro. They started inserting storylines and trying to get a rise out of the characters. So there were some performative moments there, but a lot of scheming too, just around the table. The second meal was at Homey Mexican restaurant, and that was a much more intimate environment, and the main characters were right in the center of the restaurant. So it was much easier to hear their conversation, and it was a much more serious conversation overall. They got right into a discussion about kids, having children. They talked about climate change. There was a skeptic at the table, and so there were lots of people fighting for climate change. I mean, it wasn't like a heated argument, but it did get a bit tense. And so that meal had its own flavor, if you will. And then the third meal was the most social of all. It was at Little Szechuan Chinese restaurant. And the main table made friends with a group at the next table over who had come for the performance. And they ended up pushing their tables together. And so there was a huge table of maybe 12 to 15 people who ended up sharing that meal together. So each one was kind of wildly different, but fun in its own way. And I actually ended up having a potluck dinner here at my house where all the strangers could come as themselves and meet each other in their real characters, their own characters. And that was really, really excellent, the stories that people told about their experiences. One woman told us that this was actually not at the potluck because she wasn't able to come, but she had written to me and said that she had gotten into a car accident a few days before the event, and at the supper she told the story of getting in the car accident, but she told it as her character. And she said it was actually a really excellent way to process what had been a pretty traumatic experience. She had been flipped across the freeway, and came out okay, miraculously, but it was interesting. She found it easier to talk about and process with a group of strangers in a character very different from her own life, but telling this true story. So things like that came out of it that were far beyond my own expectations of what might happen.
Now, did everybody who came into the restaurant to eat know that there was a play going on, or were there was there a sort of audience and then a ring of the bizarrely and grotesquely puzzled?
Yeah, and then I would say there was even another ring of those who were completely oblivious. We had all of it. Certainly people came who knew about the event, although sometimes it took them a few minutes to realize the event was already happening behind them, because they came looking for a performance, and there was no guarantee that this would be performative, because it's just 6 people coming together for dinner, and whatever happens is the performance. But you may or may not know which 6 people dining together in the restaurant are the main characters or are acting. So actually at the third dinner, I was seated with another couple who had come for the event because they wanted to fit as many people close to the main table as they could. And the 6 strangers were in the process of entering and sitting down together and meeting each other for the first time. And the couple that I was sitting with asked me, so where do you think this performance is going to take place? And I kind of looked behind me and I said, I think it's right there. But meanwhile, at the table behind us, a separate table from the main characters, there was another large group, I would say maybe 5 or 6 people sitting at that table, and they were talking very loudly and having a great time. And I'm pretty sure they had no idea this was going on right nearby. But anyone who came for the event might have thought that they were the main characters acting. So there were those levels, and then there were certainly people who came to the restaurant and caught on that something was going on, but weren't quite sure what it was. And I think some of them were informed, at the first dinner. I think there was a pretty large group who came in for a separate event, and I think the waiters let them know that this thing was happening over here. But then there were certainly others at other restaurants who just stumbled upon it and might have thought they were just, acquaintances having a strange conversation.
This is an experiment at a lot of levels, and I feel a certain impulse to take it apart the way you take apart the tissues of a frog or something. Hopefully with less trauma to one part of this is dispensing with the stage.
Yes.
And also dispensing with the convention that everybody who is at the play knows that they're at a play. What's that like? It's not clear where the performance ends. Mm-hmm. And it's not clear that everyone who is an audience member from the standpoint of seeing the play is an audience member in the sense of having a proper audience member attitude.
Right.
So what's that all about?
Yeah.
Is this new? Is this a part of a long tradition of avant-garde theater of which I know nothing? How does this go?
Well, there is a long tradition of doing performance outside conventional spaces, and certainly doing it in public spaces in sort of an invisible way, or maybe visible, maybe not visible. But people are constantly experimenting with what those boundaries are, and I'm particularly interested in the performance of everyday life and how we perform ourselves in different settings, and to what extent those personas are our real selves. Are they all our real selves? Do we embellish ourselves? What are those lines? So there's something really interesting to me about embracing a totally fictional character, but inevitably bringing yourself into it, which is something all actors do on stage too. But putting it in a public setting, the lines become even blurrier, because there are questions about who's acting and who's not. There are questions about how much fiction even the main characters have embraced. I gave them these character profiles all as prompts, and I said, take it or leave it. This is the character, this is who you are, this is where you're coming from, this is what brought you to dinner, this is your background, your family, your education, your work. things like that. But I told them, you can disregard any of that if you'd like to make up your own story or just use yourself. It's up to you. And different people embrace different levels of fiction. So I find that interesting. And I find the very real conversations that happen in that setting very interesting. That most of the participants did not have an acting background, actually. And there were 40 submissions for 18 spots. So there was clearly this interest in participating in this kind of setting, and I think a lot of the interest came from people who would never set foot on a stage, but were intrigued by the prospect of seeing what this could be like in maybe a more like on more level ground, maybe in this public space where anyone might or might not be acting and no one necessarily knows. So it's kind of a place where you can be a little mysterious and try things that you wouldn't normally try. I had one person who came to see the suppers who was not acting. She wasn't interacting, really. She mostly was just watching. She said that over the course of the evening, she felt like all the rules for social interaction had changed. Like suddenly by the end of the meal, she was joking with her waiter in a different way, and she was observing people in a different way, and had a sense that she could do anything. She could go up to anyone and say anything, and it would be part of the excitement. But she wasn't acting, so it was just the being surrounded by that was changing her perspective on the social norms. And I think that raises interesting questions about what are these social norms and what rules are we deciding to go by, what rules do we feel like we have to go by, and what does it take for us to feel like those rules don't matter anymore?
I may just have dirty ears, but I think if I were to come to something like this, I never can follow the discussion at the next table in a restaurant, or at least I seldom can. And sometimes I've had discussions. I was just as happy no one was following. So there was some way that this got set up such that there really was an audience who could hear most of what was happening. How did that go?
Well, and this is all part of the experiment a little bit too, because I didn't want to force that possibility. Like I didn't want to draw lots of attention to the main table or smush the tables in closer to it, so people could hear better. So I really wanted to see what people could pick up just seated normally. And it's definitely piecemeal. You can't pick up everything. You can't hear everything. And I think there's something interesting in that. Partly, I'm interested in sort of the partial experience of that. So, you're picking up some things, but not others. It's an incomplete experience, and there's something interesting about that. It also encouraged interaction. I think some people got bored quickly, and so they started looking for ways to interact with the main table, which just made a lot of things more interesting. It spurred tap dances, it spurred poetry readings. There was one participant who happened to have a book of poetry with him and spontaneously decided to go read a poem to the main table, just performatively. And that kind of set the course of the action, because of course the people at the main table thought that was supposed to happen. And so then they were trying to figure out what that was about and what it meant. And so I like that the incompleteness of the experience spurs some proactive engagement with the performance. Yeah, I guess.
I think it seems important to do this in a community where people aren't already too crazy. So that the notching up of the craziness is not to Mad Hatter level.
I mean, you really wonder what would happen. I feel like certainly in Minnesota, there's a certain politeness. There were all these seeds that the characters could cultivate if they wanted to. There were seeds for friction and for arguments, and if they let those things come out, it could have gone to more dramatic places if they wanted to. And what I discovered is no one wants to. People want to stay polite. They want to have a nice time. They want to, and part of that is just meeting new people for the first time. Like, it's social behavior. But I think especially here in Minnesota and with this pool of participants, people didn't necessarily want to get too rambunctious. So I would be curious to see what happens in another setting where maybe it's a more, I don't know. I certainly was also imagining all the terrible things that could happen, as far as I would hate for this event to happen and for people to be throwing food or otherwise disrupting the restaurant in a way that was more of a burden than support to the restaurant. So it's dangerous, doing experiments with public, the unknown public, whoever shows up. There's always a little element of, or a big element of risk, and I was seeing what happened.
For some reason, the last week or so, the old movie King of Hearts is in my head. The abandoned town taken over by the very theatrical inmates of the local asylum, who then take on all the roles of the town, but with a twist. I think it's the absence of a pope plus the absence of a government that makes me think that we're in a time when the inmates can come out and take over.
No one's, occasionally people who came to see the project who knew me would, they'd ask me if I had planned something or if I had inserted this event, and I kept saying, I have no responsibility. Actually, I mean, I have a lot of responsibility, but I had not orchestrated anything that was supposed to happen besides 6 people coming together for dinner. So, but, people are expecting that there's more orchestration or that someone must be in charge of what's going on here. But it was really the collective that was steering it.
Were you ever tempted to mic the main table?
I thought about that as not so much for this version of the project, but in thinking about ways this project could look if it continued or happened in even bigger restaurants, that are just, if you had lots more people show up in a bigger space, it would be, it really suits itself to an intimate environment the way I had designed it right now. But that would add a whole other layer of very performative quality to it in terms of directing our focus, and it would be more satisfying in terms of the actually catching what people are talking about and framing that, but it would take away, I think, that interesting ambiguity of who's a performer and who's not. So I think I would miss that with the miking, but it certainly maybe would be more, maybe a more entertaining or interesting audience experience.
Yeah. My ears would appreciate it if you mic the people. And you still wouldn't get everything.
Right.
If you mic'd it too loud, you'd essentially dampen every other conversation. But if you mic'd it at the level of the musical performers in a coffee house where people still feel quite free to talk, you'd get some of it. I have a sense that there's a middle ground to the restaurants that were participating. I mean, I know restaurants where, at least on the right night, this would be everybody in the restaurant because A, it's small, and B, it's struggling at that level. A little bit of takeout business, but I can think of a number, not bad restaurants either.
Yeah.
And then I can think of places that are, places like Quang that are so busy that I think it would be sort of inconceivable. And then they don't need this kind of help anyhow.
Right.
So how did you choose your restaurants?
I just went walking and driving along University Avenue and I just spent some time looking at who was there. And I went into quite a few of these places. I had eaten at Homey before, and it was on my radar for that reason. I had passed the other places, and ultimately I was just looking at places that at the time were really the construction was really impeding on access to them. There are all kinds of businesses along University Avenue that are struggling, and I had to narrow it down at some point. But I started out just going into some of them and asking if they would be interested in something like this. And I did get some no's. I think it sounds daunting, or it sounds like it might be extra work. But at the end of the day, really, the restaurants didn't really have to do anything besides serve the table as they would any other group. And I think the ones that I ended up working with really understood that and were kind of excited by it. Non-Bistro was especially looking for ways they might participate, as far as having a waiter who was in character and contributing to the action that was going on. The others were just wonderful hosts and very, I think none of us really knew what to expect until it happened, and then it made sense a little bit more, seeing people come in. But I ended up really just going with the ones who seemed open and interested in the idea, and I think they all definitely had their own sort of interactions with the construction and a certain amount of need in terms of bringing in business. We scheduled, all of the dinners were on Tuesday or Wednesday nights, which tend to be slower anyway. It wasn't necessarily, I'm not sure how much, there were certainly a few people at each meal who had never been to the restaurants before. It wasn't like hordes and hordes of audience members, but my hope is that also the publicity around the event and the word of mouth will really be helpful to them.
Oh. Now, as somebody who routinely interacts with strangers in bizarre ways, setting up scripts, it's always the same script. I suppose I could vary it. If you'd invited 6 people who didn't know each other, they would obviously have come as the characters they are.
Yes.
If you'd, as it were, run through the phone book or run through the popular bios, or for that matter, run through the database of the Institute for Advanced Study, you could have assembled whatever cast of real characters you wanted.
Yes.
And the same kind of artificial dynamic. That is, you would have produced something that would not have happened without your engineering. I guess I'm curious what, and this has been done. They've done, discussion groups where they invited the chief of police and the florist and the barber, and I've always wanted to do one where you had a table with people separated with each person separated around the table by about $30,000 a year of income.
Yeah.
And see what happens as that group interacts. I'm wondering about the difference between these experiments, which are totally non-theatrical, sort of public policy. The Humanities Commission did one back when it was doing public programs, where you just sort of see what happened. Or the Romans used to get animals from all over the empire, animals that would never meet, and put them in the Colosseum just to see what they do. I think of my birthday parties is like that. I mean, I'm always realizing that I will be the only person that most of the people know at a birthday party.
Right.
And that's always been the thrill of it. I'm wondering what it adds or how it changes it to make it a theatrical affair, or to write the roles, or what you see happening there.
Yeah. I think there's, in some ways, I know it's intimidating. It's more intimidating in some ways to have this added layer of acting or being someone else. But in some ways, I think for many of the participants, it was also very liberating, because in some ways you can sort of hide behind this persona and you have things to latch onto, so you don't have to be as vulnerable talking about yourself or being, playing yourself. And in some ways, I think that eventually made people more comfortable talking as themselves, because they could kind of choose how personal they wanted to make it. So that was an interesting thing. And then I also, people, when they submitted their interest to participate, I asked them to just tell me some things about themselves, and they had the choice of what to tell me. But based on what they told me, I tailored the characters a little bit. So, we had a university professor who was playing someone who manages a grocery store. And, people in some cases in quite different occupations or economic statuses or life backgrounds than themselves. And there's something really interesting, I think, about putting yourself in those shoes. And actors are used to it, and it's something they do all the time. But I think that is one of the most valuable things someone can take away from studying acting, is that perspective and that ability to see what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. So in a way, I wanted to make that accessible to a broader population, to have, give people the opportunity to have that experience, for whatever it's worth to them, and just the liberation of kind of having this role to hide inside. And I had another thought that I just lost. It went away. I'll let you know when it comes back.
Will do. Stop everything if it comes back. So you have deniability in your role, or an ambiguity is how much is this meant? How much is this just the role speaking?
Right.
A deniability you generally don't have in ordinary life, although I think actors tend to claim it, even in ordinary life. they tend to, they tend to theatricalize relationships, and this is one of the problems with actors, is that you just never know.
I would say there's plenty of non-actors who do the same thing.
Yeah, but it's like they've got a professional license.
Right.
There's a wonderful movie, Alan Alda. It was wonderful. It's awful in a lot of ways, but Alan Alda plays a guy who's written a book about the Revolutionary War. And so the whole, a troupe descends on this little town to enact the book. And so suddenly a whole bunch of actors are in this little town, and they're having, all of these high intensity relationships with the townsfolk. But there is this thing that they are also actors and not to be trusted. And it's very clear. They're not to be taken at face value because they are actors. As if one might say, well, anybody could be taken as face value, but still, it's a difference.
Yeah, so I think, in this event, I think that permission, in a way, that that license was valuable in terms of giving people different ways to feel comfortable participating. It was understood, by the participants that they were all in character. Of course, it was ambiguous on the outside, but it, the project in general, I wanted to create different ways for people to participate. So if you're comfortable putting on that persona, you can do that. If you're not comfortable putting on that persona, you can just come watch. If you're kind of in the middle, you can come as a character and interact if you feel like it, but not if you don't want to. So I wanted to give those different inroads, and at the end of the day, I think it really comes down to a shared experience. Everyone has shared this wacky experience together, and there are different levels of truth that have happened, which maybe spark conversations later. I mean, I think a lot of people came to this dinner that I held afterwards full of questions for each other. Who are you really? What do you really do? And of course we can get philosophical and think, well, now who are we performing ourselves to be as we answer these questions? But everyone came to this dinner feeling like they knew each other really well, even though they might know nothing about each other. But since they had this shared experience, there was a comfortability with each other that I think is a little different maybe than if they had initially come together as themselves and had to kind of perform their own identities. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it keeps happening with various kinds of things done for other purposes, consciousness raising groups of various kinds that enact, say, social role differences, or the blue-eyed, brown-eyes experiment that they keep doing in schools and prisons and things, that there's a strange change after people come off the roll, including, oddly, in schools, a change in academic ability that persists for years. When something about explicitly acting and then not does something to people.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So how did you construct the roles? I mean, what were you thinking as you were writing these? Was it just a lark, or?
A little of both. I was going back and forth about how performative I wanted to invite people to be and how outrageous it could be or entertaining. But I kind of kept coming back to, no, I want these to be people you might meet in St. Paul. Just, average people that are around, but who might not necessarily come to dinner together. And so what happens when they do, So I ended up kind of just inventing people, mostly starting with who they are now, what their occupations are. So we had a novelist, and we had an aerobics instructor, and we had at least one professor, we had a banker, people from kind of different walks of life, and I had limited information about who would be playing these roles. So in some cases I could get a sense of their age range based on what they had submitted, but in some cases I had no idea. So some of them I went ahead and said, you have children, you are at this stage in your life or in your career. And some of them I had to keep pretty broad just because I had no idea who that person was going to be. And what would be realistic for them. So that was a really interesting exercise for me in crafting characters. But yeah, I wanted to also give them, just as I wanted multiple ways to participate in the project, I wanted these main characters to have multiple ways they could interact with who they were. So I might give them a particular quality, but then I would give them an out from it if they didn't want to go that route. Like, I think the one who was a banker, I feel like that could be an awfully difficult role to play if you don't really know anything about that world and finance. And if people ask you questions about what you do, it could, without doing lots of advanced research, that could be tricky. So, and that goes for just about any occupation, I guess. But I said, this is what you do, but you leave work at work and you try not to talk about it when you're outside work. So, that gave that character permission to, if someone asked her a question she didn't know how to answer, she knew she could say, I leave work at work, I don't talk about it. So little things like that, I tried to fold in as I was writing them. And of course, overall, I gave people permission to take or leave what they wanted to.
Was your unit of writing the individual characters, or were you thinking about the community, the three communities?
I was definitely orienting from these characters coming to this restaurant in this neighborhood. And I was largely thinking about the individual characters sort of independent from the group, although I did I inserted some things with one character that could spark a question with another character, or things that were opposite from character to character, so that there might be things that come up that they could talk about or disagree about or agree about or have in common. Like the character who was a novelist, I had at least one person in her group that had read all of her books. And so, when it came out that that's who she was, that person kind of knew exactly who she was. And so there were little overlaps like that. And there were references speckled all throughout all of the characters to St. Paul and the Twin Cities and the neighborhoods, Frogtown, the places that they were coming from.
There are obviously a lot of places to take this. One that occurs to me is, it was a one-time affair. You could play it out over years if you wanted to. All kinds of things could happen if this group kept getting together.
Yeah.
But there are many other, of course, ways of playing it out and ways of reshuffling and fooling around. Are any of these attracting you, or is this a chapter of your life that you want to close with that little silver key and put it up in a little place and go on to something else?
Multiple people had said, it would be great if this continued. It would be great for it to be like every Friday at a different restaurant. There's one of these events where people come together, and I would, as we were doing them just over the course of the 3 meals, I was observing a lot of things that were happening and thinking about ways I would do it differently at different places, or ways I could improve the experience for different people. And it's definitely something that might reappear down the line. It was also much more consuming than I expected it to be somehow. I got, writing all the characters took me probably 3 times as long as I expected it to, just because I got really involved in thinking about how these people were coming together and who their characters are compared to who I knew them to be based on their very limited profiles they had submitted. And, it opened up a lot of interesting things to think about, and was successful on a lot of levels that were somewhat unexpected to me. Like, some really interesting stories came out of it, and I think the restaurants were happy with how it went. So it's definitely something I would like to revisit, but I have a lot of questions about how and where and how that would look, where I would want to take it. One interesting conversation that came out of the which supper was it? The second supper, I think. There was one participant who is involved with. She works at the U, and she works on getting people from different parts of the food system talking to each other. And in fact, I wonder if she's done a bad interview before. So she was one of the strangers, and she started talking afterwards about how interesting it could be to use this model in getting people from different parts of the food systems talking to each other. So to get a farmer talking to a policymaker, but maybe they play each other, or play, characters similar to each other. What would that be like? What kind of conversation might come out of that? So I'm also now thinking about situations like that this could be a model for. There's a lot of possibility.
Yeah, and it would matter in that context whether you worked with people who knew a great deal about what these other roles were like.
Right.
In the rural area, you know the implement dealer.
Right.
And you know the local pastor, and you know all these
Right.
folks well enough to be pretty sure how they're going to come at
Yeah.
most anything.
Yeah.
As opposed to, having a bus driver play a banker. You play with stereotypes, but
Right.
so it's fascinating to think about that.
Yeah. Speaking of stereotypes, one of the things that I really wanted to avoid in creating these characters were stereotypes or caricatures of who these characters could be. So one of the things I tried to do was to give a lot of very specific detail about who these people were and their lives. And so rather than just sending people an assignment that says, you are a banker, your name is this, there were a lot more specifics about how they had come to be a banker and who they were outside of their occupation. And I feel like that is definitely a component that I would want to keep and maybe expand on if we did it again.
Right. Playing with sexual orientation would be great fun.
Oh, that happened to some extent. Yes.
Well, when I heard about your project, when it was still going on, I was sort of surprised at my own response. It provoked my fear of clowns and mimes big time. It made me realize just how profoundly I value the fourth wall. How much I do not want. I mean, the only time I've ever been really moved by actors coming off the stage was one performance where dancers jumped off the stage and began quite vigorously making out with what appeared to be audience members. I sort of thought, you can't help thinking, well, that could have been me. Of course, it couldn't have been you, but there was something about that was charming. But when the guys with axes come into the audience, it's just, I don't know, I'm trying to interrogate this response, this sense of, no, no, I have no idea what to do with this person.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what I'm responding to here. And I mean, it's not like I'm, a sort of theatrical virgin. I mean, I've done improv. In theatrical context, I know a tiny bit what to do. But it's a strange thing to think about doing this and to realize it's how much I didn't want to go to one of these things.
Well, and that's a big reason why I was trying to create multiple ways of entry, because I personally I do a lot of performance work. I do a lot of participatory performance work. But I hate being forced to participate when I go to events. I like having the choice, and sometimes I will choose to participate, but I don't like being forced to, and especially in a theater setting where you're really on the spot. So I was trying to think, how could I structure this so that people can participate at different levels according to what they want to do, and can they come and observe but not participate at all? So that's why I thought, some people could just come eat at the restaurant and they could sit very far away, but they could kind of watch from afar if they're curious. But it is, it's also a very difficult event to explain. And I was grateful that we did get some press, because I think that really helped get the word out in a nice, coherent way. But it's, if you just hear, that it's like a participatory theatrical dinner event, all kinds of associations might pop to mind. I kept trying to explain to people, it is not murder mystery dinner. It is not, it's not necessarily even going to be terribly performative or entertaining in the way you often think of a dinner theater piece. It's more of an experiment in social behaviors, but with the potential to kind of go either way.
Yeah, I keep running into this phenomenon. I've got to think about it, because it's over and over again. Theater people wanting to do something that's not exactly theater. So, Setu Jones has this thing coming, the mile-long dinner table,
right.
And it's a real meal, and it's sort of real community development. It's also theater. And this runs pretty close to things that people have done as real public education, real community development, real economic development. There seems to be an impulse from a lot of theatrical sides to get, to do something real. I don't know if it's because money's drying up and so doing just theater is not going to pay the bills. You've got to do you worry. I mean, a rainbow is going downhill when it starts adding toys, at a massage parlor. And not that, but I just. I'm trying to understand this phenomenon of artists wanting to do something that's not exactly art, but still is art, kind of. I'm curious how you think about that.
I think a lot of it comes from a place of investigating the form, like investigating what theater is and what it might be beyond our kind of traditions. For me, that's definitely a big part of it. I'm curious about the boundaries of theater, and it's sort of like looking at the boundaries of our solar system. It's like, can you define what they are? I'm interested in what are the lines between theater and everyday life, and I don't think it's as clear cut as entering into a theater space. So that's a big part of it. I think there's also a lot of there are certain traditions of theater or certain, spaces that are largely accessible to certain populations and not others. So I think there's a big interest in a lot of theater artists to find ways to make theatrical work more accessible to a wider variety of people who may or may not have an interest in engaging with it, but making it available. And interacting with other kinds of people and other kinds of artists in a more meaningful way. So, it would be exciting and interesting to me to do some kind of theatrical experiment with people working in food systems, because I don't interact with those people necessarily in my everyday life. So it's sort of a structure around which we can have more conversation, have a shared experience that leads to more meaningful relationships. I think that's the drive for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
There's certainly now some more funding available for projects like that, so that might also be spurring some thinking. But I think largely it has more to do with branching out of sort of insular worlds.
Mm-hmm. Well, at the top of the theater food chain, you've got, people like Gwyneth Paltrow who, they play things, and those things are sometimes pretty interesting and powerful. And they also save elephants, and they use the fact that everybody recognizes them to save more elephants.
Mm-hmm.
But at this lower down level, there's this fascinating question about the place of theater artists in the society.
Mm-hmm.
What they're good for. I mean, one thing they're good for is wonderful fake reality. If you want to see who Shakespeare could fall in love with, Gwyneth Paltrow will show you. If you want to see what what a really horrible person is like Anthony Hopkins can show you. But you must have done some thinking about this matter of what a theater artist, what role your sort of theater artist has in the community.
Yeah. I think this is a big question we're asking ourselves all the time. I think certainly one role of theater can be to, a lot of people will quote the mirror, we're showing a mirror to society and, reflecting what is happening in the world and maybe framing it in a way that it can be really seen and digested. That can be one function of theater. I think just coming together for a shared experience is a valuable thing that theater, it very literally does build community in a certain sense, because it brings people into physical spaces together. That's something that is arguably different from a lot of other art forms that don't rely necessarily on that live shared experience. It can certainly raise questions about topical things. It can stimulate dialogue about topical things. It can also just help us think more expansively. I think I've been veering towards more and more, besides the Stranger Supper series, I'm working with these dancers and veering towards more kind of abstract kinds of writing, and not necessarily character-based or plot-based, not necessarily action-driven, more meditative and contemplative. And there is something valuable to me about creating that space for myself in the process, and also for people who come to experience it. We live in a very saturated world, and it's not so often that we stop and are really present and taking something in and maybe going into the meditative space that it allows us to enter. So that is something I'm interested in creating, and I'm still kind of figuring out, what that means and if it's of value to people. But my sense is that it maybe is. In my last interview with Bat, I talked a little bit about the Eric N. piece, What a Stranger May Know, that I was helping produce a reading of, which is 27 plays happening simultaneously and reflecting on the Virginia Tech shooting. And so that is an example of a piece where you can't possibly take everything in, but you're drifting through it and having an experience and kind of a space to think about some pretty hard things in community with other people who are also thinking about them. So I think that that's something theater offers that I think is kind of rare and valuable.
Thank you.